this. So these are more or less the side effects or the consequences of the political fallout of the past governments and their failures. Now, these are you may call them symptoms, and I don't think we are misleading anyone if you were to call them symptoms, because even if you take the most devastating aspect of the economic crisis, which is inflation and the lack of foreign reserve currencies, that too is a resultant effect of the larger economic policy. And I believe many political scientists, many experts in the field have made comments echoing these sentiments. They've made similar reflections stating that, you know what, this is actually the making of a much larger policy, and that the lack of a policy is to blame here. And I think we cannot further this discussion in any way, and I don't think we'll be doing a good enough job if you were to dismiss these concerns and these problems we have in the status quo. So, of course, I drew reference to the economic crisis, which is probably the most obvious one, and of course the political crisis. And let me shed a bit of light on the political crisis, so to speak. Now, currently, the highest office in the land, the office of the executive president, is held by His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa was preceded by Maithripala Sirisena, His Excellency Maithripala Sirisena, the former president. And these individuals, they both occupy the highest office in the land, but made significant changes to that office. And there are major changes from the transition from Maithripala Sirisena's tenure to Gotabaya Rajapaksa's now presidency. And these things would be important later on, but I want you to understand one thing above all else. The office of the executive president wields significant political power in Sri Lanka, and is responsible for a lot of policies and a lot of governmental direction in terms of its of the movement and overall political decision making of Sri Lanka. So therefore, it becomes important to realize who would be the next candidate, which brings me to the current political issue, which is the fact that, as His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa has noted earlier, but although in a satirical manner, there is a leadership crisis to an extent, a leadership crisis which has created a large discontent in society, a divide, if you will. And this is mainly due to the fact that we don't have a successor. Sri Lanka, of course, needs a successor to, be groomed to the role of president. I do not like to say groomed, but for the lack of a better word, let's use that particular word. Right. So that is it for the political and economical crisis of the country. But I know for a fact that the political crisis extends far greater than to the points that I spoke about. And one of the major points of consideration in the recent past has been the rights of our citizens, the rights of Sri Lankan citizens. As of right now, there is no legal regime supporting the rights of gender minorities, and even minority protection in this country has not been the most ideal. In fact, many human rights agencies have drawn concern over those matters, and who better than to explain and to sum up the status quo in Sri Lanka with regards to those especially the gender minority concerns and of course interests, than our very own Dhyani Hapuarachchi, who I believe is a great authority on the matter. And yes, over to you, Dhyani. Can you give us an insight on the matter?
Insight on what specifically?
Just as per your understanding, the rights that the gender minorities in Sri Lanka are seeking, and whether those rights have been granted, at least to an extent, and what obstacles they might encounter in their lives currently.
Right. Here's the thing, right? I think the basics of whatever that needs to be covered in the economical and political aspects of it is already and has been already given a basic idea by Nohim. What I do believe is this political crisis has led to a social lack of social progression or social stagnation that comes with it, that we oversee because of the political issues, right? In a country like Sri Lanka, right, we are at a place where it's so easy to blame the government or blame the leadership at all costs, that we don't see where society stands and how society is deprived, and society deprives each other of certain particular matters, right? The reason I believe that Nohim is specifically focusing on gender minorities and very liberal, you might say, according to Sri Lankan politics, ideas as such, I believe is because this particular party, JVP, has been focused on it recently, right? And the importance that we have to see here is, right, Sri Lanka, first of all, is not a country that has uh, lobbying groups or political pressure groups that work well enough to be granting these things, right? Therefore, we need to solely depend on political parties to grant these specific social rights. And the issue here is, right, neither the UNP nor the SLFP are at a place where they're focusing on these things. That is A, because them as political parties have set their goals in this very, to say it very informally, in this very petty way of countering each other, instead of actually creating social progression or progression as a nation as a whole, right? On a second level, I think it's based on the fact that society in itself isn't ready for these large social changes, or they, as a political party, fear that kind of change because of the backlash that's going to come with it, right? Because of this very reason, we see a drastic contrast between UNP, SLFP as the two main dominant parties, and JVP as a third party that isn't as small as minor parties, quote unquote, but has some sort of power, but still lags behind from these two dominant parties, right? Because the main reason is we see a drastic contrast from the two policy papers that were presented by UNP and SLFP for the past president's election versus the JVP candidates policy paper, right? Now the conflict has come to the point where it is a certain sector of society, that being youth, that being oppressed minorities, that being quote unquote woke people, have rallied under this JVP or have created this new notion where they support the JVP on the basis that they will create this social progression that the SLFP and UNP has not done so far and has failed to do so and refuses to acknowledge. I think that would be enough for now.
Yes, thank you, Dhyani. That was a brilliant reflection, a brilliant summary of the status quo, and especially with regards to the gender minorities, as we earlier mentioned, and of course that insight is very important, as this group historically, as we will know, have not enjoyed as much representation as we would want to allot them, as we as a people should allot them, and that has been the focus of contemporary politics, and that is indeed a paradigm shift that we see in Sri Lankan politics. And I think part of the discussion has to be centered around the adaptability, the flexibility, if you will, of these political parties. And just before we further the discussion, I'd like to make a point to say that the current successionist group of the SLFP, which is the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the SLPP, is the current party in power. They are the government party, and the SLPP is a very peculiar animal, a very rare animal.
If I may to add something here,
yes,
please
sir,
clarify to our foreign observers here that SLPP is another version of SLFP. Right, so they have the same nationalistic approach, and pretty much the supporters are the same. Right, SLFP is like SLPP is the upgraded version, the evolved version of SLFP.
Exactly, which is the reason I mentioned that it was the successionist state of the party of the SLFP, because like Mr. Gimhan just stated, it's quite similar to in its beliefs, in its policies, quite similar to the SLFP. In fact, at a time, the current leadership of the SLPP held pretty much all the major positions within the SLFP, most notable being Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was in fact the chairman of the SLFP at the time. There was an internal disagreement which prompted the breakaway of this fringe group, but the rather important point to note here was the fact that the SLPP secured a majority in parliament after it broke away as a successionist group. And the SLFP, while notable in its representation in parliament, does not compare in contrast to the SLPP as a major political party per se, as of the current standing. But it in no way means that it's incapable of doing that. We've seen it historically being capable of doing a great deal. In fact, it was like it is mentioned in the context slide, one of the major political powerhouses of Sri Lanka. And the most important thing to note here is, like Dhyani stated, the JVP has always been a custodian, champion of liberal schools of thought. They have, in fact, championed the most recent being the movement for gender minorities and their rights. And these rights have been championed as a part of their political ideology. Now, like I believe I made a point to say early on that most political parties in Sri Lanka do not have a sense of direction, mainly owing to the fact that they do not have proper ideological conviction. But I believe evidence attests to this claim, which is the fact that the JVP has those ideological convictions. I am in no way a supporter of not in any ways biased towards the JVP. I am merely a political commentator, I assure you. And what I'm trying to convince you here of is, rather, what I'm trying to imprint in you is the idea that when you consider the JVP, the reasons, their motivations for these to ascribing with these, or to ally with themselves with these liberal schools of thought, is mainly because they follow a socialist political ideology. In socialism, it's not their part to discriminate those who have been discriminated. In fact, socialism is built on the tendency of empowering those discriminated groups, those groups which have been marginalized, as we well know. So it has very much been an allied movement from the beginning. It's just that the question remains whether the JVP can occupy power. And for that, before I move on to my esteemed colleague Neth and his reflections on the matter, I would like to just shed some light into the history of the JVP. Now, an accusation that's levied against the JVP is that how can a party that has not occupied a preeminent role in Sri Lankan politics so suddenly, so abruptly create a government, and how can we expect such a party to be successful in governance? That is pretty much the major point of contention in this debate as I see it. And generally in Sri Lankan politics, this has been a heated conversation, a contentious point, if you will, in contemporary as well as recent discussions. And this is mainly due to the fact that
something I have to add there.
Yes,
Another
please.
reason JVP is sort of like being accused is because in 1988 and 89, also in 1971, twice they attempted to get Sri Lanka's power through an armed revolution, through bloodshed, right? So they weren't always a democratic party. So because people still remember some of the violent measures that they took to take power back in the day. That is another reason that JVP is sort of like rejected by people.
So I believe we need to specifically talk about that afterwards,
Yes,
especially
but
given how the context.
Yeah, sure. Just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Exactly, but a point to consider.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And it's definitely something that is in the scope of discussion for today. And
Nohim,
yes,
maybe discuss this part of what you are talking about separately, and then
Will
tell
do.
on the other side of it separately, because especially because
Sure.
it is not provided like at all in the context. But I
Will
do
do.
think it's a very heavily going to be a very heavily debated matter.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's not mentioned in the context, I sort of don't want the foreigners to sort of like completely not be aware of that.
Right, right.
So that's
Exactly.
why I
Be caught
mentioned
off
that,
guard. Yes.
it was like around like 30 years back. So it's not a recent thing, but that is also a factor, like they have been receiving lesser votes as one of the reasons. So that should be mentioned. Yeah, you can continue. Sorry.
Thank you. And yes, as Gimansa mentioned, the insurrections of 1971 was, of course, a catalyst in creating this paradigm, or rather environment of hostility, I would say, against the JVP. And of course, there are faults attributable to both sides in this conflict, and I believe an independent discussion, as many noted here, would be important in this panel discussion. But yes, before I move on to that, I'd like to draw reference on the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, the JVP did in fact hold a coalition government with the SLFP at the time. So hence, it has proved itself capable of being in power. And I believe the government of the 13th sitting of the parliament was dissolved when the JVP gave out its reins of power. The party with which the coalition was there was initiated, and the memorandum of understanding was established, had dissipated. And then, of course, they gave away power. And so as a result, the government of the day lost its influence in parliament. I believe the parliament was since dissolved. I'm not entirely sure about that fact, but the point I would like to note there is how the JVP has, in fact, in time proved itself capable, and through democratic means. I would like to say that is a very important point, as I see in this debate, to consider. And at that time, there was, in fact, economic development, progress, even while the civil war subsisted, even while it was exacerbated. It, in fact, the government at the time managed to make sure that there was sufficient economic development. Now, a concern in modern day politics is how Sri Lanka is to recover from the economic grave that it is in right now. The condition in the country has been one of economic crisis. And yes, I'd like to get a reflection on the economic crisis on a much deeper scale, and of course to cover the JVP insurrection, if he's able. Neth, if you would be willing to shed some light on the matter.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nohim. I think in terms of the basic idea of the economic and political situation in the country, Nohim and Dhyani covered it all. But what we need to consider when it comes to the motion, and as a person who's novel to this whole aspect, is understand what principles this political party functions on and how that inherently affects the whole idea of what Nohim mentioned in terms of the economic stability and the sort of the economic background of the country, right? What's important to note here is, because when we go throughout this discussion, we find points for and against the motion regarding this point, right? What's important to notice here is capitalizing the status quo, that is to say that the current economic crisis we're facing, is that which political party renders a great service and able to at least move forward in this crisis. At that point in time, it's important to notice the party principles which both of the parties function in, right? Because the word change is a very dangerous word that is included in the context, because the context says that, okay, the party is willing to change in terms of a socialist, right? But also we need to understand the fact that the JVP inherently was created, and why JVP is significant among the other minor political socialist parties in Sri Lanka was the insurgents and the revolution that they created throughout that time, right? Which was clearly evident throughout Sir's and Nohim's speeches, right? Because capitalizing on stakeholders like the minority and the youth at that time, facing problems like education, facing problems like inflation and whatnot, I think the youth was more attracted to them because they were seeking this revolution, answers that the government was not enough, like the government was not capable to provide at that time. Right? I think that's how the JVP grew as a group in terms of capitalizing the youth and the minority. Why? Because the government failed in that aspect. Right. So I think as a whole, there are different aspects to this discussion in terms of economy, which will structure our sort of conversation on. But understand that the theories that this party function on is that, okay, if you are a politician, in terms of like, because they function on socialist and Marxist theories, if you are a politician, you're coming to the country to serve the country wholeheartedly. That is to say that you should not expect a benefit in return. You're coming to a country in order to govern the country, right? Because you understand that, because this is a very controversial topic in Sri Lanka, if you're supporting or opposing the JVP, right? And many reasons, the majority are opposing the JVP. Like we as debaters collecting facts also, you see the public talking about this, right? So the main thing to notice here is in terms of the JVP, right? We fail to see certain financial strategies not being there, like Dhyani said, in terms of their policies and whatnot, in comparison to the other parties, right? Because you see, we understand these theories that they function on and the whole idea of them being inexperienced, right? These financial strategies of these Marxist ideologies may actually not comply with the existing economic crisis, right? Then the question becomes on which party can at least give an immediate solution on the principles they're functioning on to get out of this crisis and move forward, right? I think that's, in terms of economy, the debate should focus on that principle and on that clash, on which party is going to take us out of this hell that we are in, at least not going steps backward, but at least moving forward, right? In terms of fixing the situation and the principles they're functioning, right? So I think as the conversation progresses, we can add things to it. I didn't contribute as much as Nohim or Dhyani, but yeah, I think in terms of basics, that's what I have to say.
And thank you, Neth, for that. I think that was very insightful. And I unfortunately will not agree with you on the point that you did not contribute as significantly as me or Dhyani did, because I believe you did bring a lot of value to the table, and I appreciate that. And I would like to make a point on something that just mentioned there, the economic recovery of the country. And I believe a major talking point in contemporary politics was the fact that Sri Lanka, in order to pick itself up from this economic turmoil that it currently finds itself in, it would require international help. And as Neth mentioned, the JVP is a party founded on socialist and Marxist ideologies, mainly on the socialist part, leaning to the socialist ideal. And as such, it is rather interesting, especially in the wake of China, increasing Chinese aggression, how a party of this nature, how a party of these convictions will move forward, and whether that pursuit would be adversarial or whether it would be more hospitable towards the Chinese. And I think that is a point to consider. I believe that the Chinese has a great say in the political future of this country. And as such, I think international, the exposure with the international community is a point that we need to consider. And to that end, I do not believe that just on the basis of the JVP having the political convictions that they do, they will not get the support of the international community. Because if the same were to be said about China, a socialist country for the most part, has been treated with open arms, and many other socialist countries, some in Europe even, have been treated with open arms. I don't think political restrictions on ideology in the 21st century would be that restrictive in terms of international trade, particularly with Sri Lanka being a member of the WTO and as such committed to trade liberalization. And even if you take the JVP's own political direction in terms of international trade and communication with the international community, they have been more than willing to accommodate for international trade, and they have been committed to those values. And one point in particular I would like to draw reference to is the JVP's direction to modernize and to capitalize on the competitive advantages of Sri Lanka, which mainly being the apparel industry and including the export of cinnamon. Perhaps one of Sri Lanka's best known exports, and indeed the creation of policies such as policies to contribute more to the nation's economy in terms of by job creation and such. And a large part of job creation was focused on by the JVP. And yes, Neth, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just to add on the term before we move on job creation, one thing we need to notice in terms of an international field, right? In this context of the debate, we need to understand, okay, this is a party which functions on leftist ideologies inherently, right? So maybe it's terms of characterizing the whole idea, it may or may not be detrimental to the country, because in an international field, it's going to be hard to form relations because you understand this country is governed by a party which is functioning on leftist ideologies, and big blocks in the European frameworks like US and UK, or like when we consider the international politics and international economy as a whole, embargo, sanctions, right? I think that's also a point to note when if this party takes power, how is the international politics and the relations going to function? Because this party is functioning on leftist principles, right? I just wanted to add.
Yes, and thank you for that reflection. And yes, and a point there, I believe, which is important to consider, especially for the national security of the country, is Sri Lanka's relations with India. India being its closest neighbor and undoubtedly one of the, if not the powerhouse of the region, the South Indian region in particular. India's relationship rather with Sri Lanka has been hospitable for the most part, has been one of understanding and friendship, and has been lasting friendship. And Sri Lanka would likely continue, and we can attest to the fact that the JVP would indefinitely continue that relationship. We don't see anything that would compromise such a relationship. And I believe the JVP has in fact made a lot of points, including the leader of the party, Kumar Dissanayake, has made several points stating that while his approach to India would be different in terms of the recent deal involving the Indian company and the purchasing of the oil tanks in the containers in Trincomalee have been a contentious issue, he does promise that he will not sever all ties with India in terms of economic cooperation and cooperation for peace in the region, but his attitude towards India would be changed, significantly different from what His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa currently has in mind and has been carrying out. Yes, Dhyani.
Right. Regarding one of the things that Neth spoke of and then elaborated by Nohim, right? This idea of which economical policies are best suited for the country, right? We talked about the JVP aspect of it and why it would be quote unquote better, or how do you say it, more suitable per se, right? But the other aspect of it, I think one of the most important piece of information that foreign debaters have to know for the day is Sri Lanka has tried to go for a mock-like socialist economical policy before. In fact, the government right now is trying to attempt towards that as well, right? And once before we have gone through that period of time where we have had a prime minister and a president working towards a socialist set of economical policies as well, right? Now the issue here was two things to regard here, right? Issue here was this economical policy as a whole fails due to how hard it is to have an entire change of socialist policies, right? Because it's built on this idea of equality, because it's built on this idea of striving for equality among all people, which is very hard to gain without taking the power by force. A democratical government isn't best suited for a job where you create socialist economic policies. Why? Because they're initially going to lose support given how hard it is to transform into that kind of aspects in the economical policy, right? Now, one thing we have to remember there is the situation at that time, the citizens at that time weren't in a situation where they understood this matter at a at the best level of it, right? And it initially got so much backlash, right? On the second level, what we need to talk about here is when we are talking about social support, right? Hi, Ruin. Hi. We need to when we are it's okay, Ruin. When you're talking about social support, right, we need to understand on the economical levels as well as social support levels, this economic policy has failed once before, right? So there is going to be embedded fear, embedded hesitancy when it comes to the economic policy as a whole as well, right? Given the present status quo, especially given how draconianly negatively people look at the import ban that's happening in the country right now, right? There's going to be issues when it comes to the socialist economic policy as well. I believe we didn't cover that area as well as we covered the other aspect of the economical policy, where we did talk a little bit more on the pros than the cons. Those things have to be taken into consideration as well. How a socialist policy has failed in the country twice, right? And how there's going to be an initial lack of support and going to be initial hesitancy when it comes to a policy as such, given the history and experience that the Sri Lankan society has on it.
Certainly a thought-provoking insight there, and I think one that is of the utmost importance to this debate. And if I may add on a little clarification there, I think, Dhyani, while I agree with you on the basis that yes, Sri Lanka, the most part, has experimented with socialist and left-leaning policies, and in fact the current government has in fact started to replicate those models, as you very correctly pointed out. But I don't think it's a modern innovation per se, and I think excluding, of course, notwithstanding what you mentioned regarding the socialist government of the day back then, when you had rationing and such policies of socialist design. But I would like to draw reference to the fact that Sri Lanka, by its constitutional makeup, is in fact socialist. Just to offer that clarification, as Sri Lanka is a committed socialist republic, and as this is something that is embedded in Article 29 of our constitution on state directive policies of the state. I believe it's Article 27. Article 27H, which speaks of free education, and Article 27.2H, that this speaks of free education. Although it doesn't necessarily say free education, it does refer to the government's duty, the duty of the state in its directive policies to ensure that the illiteracy of the country is at an all-time low, as it is their duty to do so, and most importantly, how that would entail further development of the country as a whole, and of course our furtherance in democracy owing to the higher levels of education. But another fact I would like to mention on that point is the fact that we in this country have free healthcare. We in fact have citizens of Sri Lanka enjoy a multitude of benefits emanating from the fact that Sri Lanka is in fact a socialist leaning country, although we have a mixed characteristics. For the most part, the UNP and the SLFP are left-leaning, capitalist oriented parties, and the SLPP was no exception. But we see the SLPP changing direction in terms of the current crisis and their shall we say a response to the current crisis. But I think what's important there to notice is how the SLPP has the successionist party of the SLFP has in fact changed its direction. And the fact that they've changed it shows a not so unwavering commitment to its beliefs, its policies and manifestos, if you will, because any political party is only as rigid and as strong as its political convictions. And one can very easily argue, and one will be correct in that assertion in saying that the SLPP doesn't have strong convictions in terms of those political ideologies, political pursuits. And one will not be wrong in that assertion, as I said, because of the fact that you need stability in a political party to continue. The lack of stability was the reason for the separation of the SLFP from the SLPP from the SLFP. And that in order for a political party to continue or to form a government, especially in fact to form a government, you need to have that stability. And that's, I think, something that we ought to consider in this debate and something we have to draw reference to. And the SLPP as of right now has internal disagreements. It has been showing the cracks are widening, so to speak. And these are concerns that we need to be aware of. Apologies, excuse me 1 minute. Right, as such, as I mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka is in fact a socialist leaning socialist public. And yes, with that clarification out of the way, to shed a bit of light onto the economic policies of the country. And I believe we do have an economics student with us, Senelka, who was agreed to be one of our panelists for this evening. Unfortunately, she was not able to join us at the outset, but she is here now. Senelka, the floor is yours if you are willing.
What bomb did you just put on me right now? Like, this entire thing sounded a bit great. Okay, you know what? Y'all talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Whenever you are ready. And Dhyani, Neth, if you have any reflections to offer, please do so. And anyone in the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise them at any point. We are more than willing to accommodate your questions at any given time, should we be able to. So please.
Sanilka.
Hey, Hari, podai na dang mama economics dira monad kata karani. Ebony, do not embarrass me.
Senelka.
In English, please. Our foreign visitors can't understand Sinhala. He was asking
Apologies on behalf of Sanilka. She speaks in Sinhala when she panics.
Yes, Senelka, if you feel uncomfortable to address the floor right now, that is understandable.
Why don't we invite Akila or Dinuka to speak for now until
of course,
Senelka can gather her
gladly. Akila, if you are willing, I would very much
I would like to invite Dinuka Perera to speak on this topic.
Gladly. Dinuka, if you are willing, please.
The ball passing between you two.
Akila, so normally when you give the topic, you need to speak about the topic because you can't just
No. I believe you're the expert here on this. So I want the foreign.
I agree with Akila.
Yes.
So Dinuka, the floor is yours.
Dinuka, floor is yours.
The floor is yours.
You can take my time as well.
I need to notify our foreign guests that these two will be the adjudicators, these two will be the panelists. Akila and Dinuka will be the panelists for the debate on Tuesday because they are co-vice presidents of our club. And I'll be bringing a visiting adjudicator from outside CIDS as the chair. And these two will be the panelists. Just mentioning that. So, okay, Dinuka, why don't you?
I'll get back to you, sir, on this. Okay, Dinuka, you can continue.
Okay, so keeping the panelist part aside, I don't know why that happened, but yeah. Sir, wait, can you all hear me first, like properly?
Audible, yes.
Oh, cool. I won't be speaking much about the political arena because I'm not a political science student. Or I don't know much about politics. Just that politics is one of my interests. That's all. Mainly, I'll focus on the economical aspects of the country. I think that would be much more beneficial. And also, before that, all the best dear educators and all the debaters here to understand like our whole political system in a nutshell like this. I mean, it should be a great achievement if you can understand it like this. I mean, really, the US Constitution must be much more easier than this, right? So starting off, well, okay, so the JVP was spoken a lot here, so I'll just shed some small light on this, and that's all. I'm not going to speak a lot on that. So one thing when Sir and also Nohim and Dhyani spoke on the JVP, one thing you need to understand is that, like they said about the riots, I think no one spoke a lot on that. So when the riots happened, I mean, it's known in Sri Lanka as Kalu Julia, or almost like Black July, right? So Black July, it's known as that because basically what happened was most of the Sri Lankans were kind of burnt and houses were set on fire, buildings were set on fire, and basically it was like the JVP. I mean, for basic example, you have the example of there was like for one house, you should get only one loaf of bread, right? If you don't get one, if you get two loaves of bread, one of your members would be dead the next day, right? So that's the kind of rules which were there in that time. I mean, I was not born, but my parents and all, like that's the generation that went through this. And also on the light of that riot part of view, it's like there is one particular generation who has the remembrance of it. And like our generation, basically people after the 2000s, does not have experience of it. And therefore, I feel like once the generation of that, the people who have the experience of it moves away from the society, for example, people, Sirs age people, or even people above our Sirs, like our grandparents, our mothers, like after they move from it, I feel like that remembrance will slowly shift away from our social aspects, right? So that could happen, right? It's just an assumption I'm bringing. Could be persistent, but also could move out from our society. That like the Black July and that experience and all. So that's all on the JVP because I'm not going to shed light on that a lot because, like I said, I'm not any political student or anything on politics. So moving on to the economical aspect of it. So now I'd like to start with the economic policies which were brought in from the present government and also contrasting to the government before that, right? So like Nohim said, the government before that was Maithripala Sirisena's government, which was almost like a government consisting of a lot of parties together, right? So that was the government then. And then after that, we have the present government, which is headed by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, right? So yeah, Nohim, thank you. I do not know these names, so these explanations are good. Right. So now when the past government was there, example, Maithripala Sirisena's government, the government was more focused on how can I say this? It was not much more focused. It was focused on improving the the gains of the improving the gains of the government's part of view, but by not hindering into the people's part of view. Like, it was like most at the beginning, right? At the beginning, it was like a people-pleasing government rather than actually like developing the country, right? Not developing like not having rapid development, but having like a people-pleasing government, right? So that was government which was there, and that was the economical approach they had. For example, the one economical approach they had was they raised up interest rates in the country, and also they reduced tax in the country, which hindered the government's gains in a very big manner. But again, like I said, they were people pleasing, right? So it was okay for the people because why? Everyone's happy when taxes are going down and interest rates are going up. So that was the issue. That was their regime, and that was when issues started coming up to how the government's treasury is going to function. Because as you know, taxes are the ways that governments get money. The main income source of the government is taxes, apart from all the other things. Mainly taxes are the thing. And when you bring down taxes, governments income is going to go down drastically, right? So that was the environment we were living in. I mean, Maithripala Sirisena's government did work into improving the revenue of the country, improving the revenue of the government. They did work, but they did not work in a broader scale, right? And also the other part that they did not much work on was the development part of scale, right? Because a lot of development phases of the country was halted mainly because the government did not have, like the government, since the tax revenue was decreasing, the government did not have a lot of money to spend on it. And also they were not that much interested on it because again, people pleasing rather than development of the country or like showing the image of the country like into some extent, right? So then comes and also by the latter part of Maithripala Sirisena's government, there were a lot of huge internal conflicts between the governments itself, inside the government, which again, I think you guys, I mean, Nohim, Dhyani, and Neth can explain much more rather than me. So that's there. And then the people, though they were people pleasing at the beginning, coming to the latter stages of their parliamentary regime, people actually hated the shit out of them, basically, right? So then comes Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his regime, and looking at their past regime, like when Mahinda's regime was there before, and then all the consecutive, even now, one of their main focuses are on bringing in foreign investments to the country and also increasing the revenue of the government, right? So those are like two major aspects they live in, and also development, right? Development in a very, very rapid scale, right? Very rapid scale. So that's the way that's the normal motto, or what the present government's scales are in. So, but then this time what happened was we hit the pandemic, COVID came into play here. And then one big issue with COVID was that when COVID came, obviously the government will help the people, right? So that's what normally happens, right? When a big national disaster there comes, the government needs to at least show a good image of them, like they're helping the people. So what happened there was the government actually reduced tax rates, though it was than it was before, right? Because in 2020, the government reduced tax revenue again. So what happened was, again, the government's income, which was hampered at the beginning, hampered in a very, very broader scale in 2020, right? Aside from that, the biggest issue was the government wasn't functioning well because of COVID-19. It was a major pandemic around the world. So the government did not have much more foreign investments than it had when it was not there. Foreign investors did come into play, but not as it was before, because again, global scale COVID pandemic. So foreign investors did have a small drawback. So we are currently in a situation in 2020, it was like that the revenue of the government decreased, and also foreign investments had a pullback from the economy of our country. Then now in present 2020, right? 2022, and at the latter stage of 2021, the biggest issue started coming into play, which was actually, it was just like a boiling time bomb, but then it kind of blasted out in the latter stage of 2021, which was Sri Lanka's foreign reserves decreasing in a very, very rapid scale. Because Sri Lanka is not a country which has all its generates or manufactures all its needs inside the country. No, that's not how it happens. We do import a very larger scale of things into our country. So what happened was, when the foreign reserves decreased, the imports were hampered in a very, very big scale, right? Then only comes into play the import bans, which were put into play by the government. Actually, the import bans were put into play almost as soon as the COVID pandemic hit, because like I said, it was a time bomb, and then the government did find it that the issue was coming in, and then they put the import ban, which was to a lot of non-essential items. For example, you have tile skirtings, which were banned, and then you have normal construction items, which were banned, and then you have luxury goods, which were banned, like vehicles, some electronic equipments were banned, and then you had numerous bans on like food items also. They were banned. I mean, luxury goods, okay, not daily essentials, luxury goods, which were banned, right? So those import bans did, I mean, it did help. I guess some of the panelists were speaking towards that it's a major controversy, but in the long run, like, I mean, looking from economical perspective, it did help the country to retain its, medicines are banned. Medicines are banned, but not all. I mean, essential medicines, yes, they were imported, but non-essentials, like I said, non-essential medicines and luxury goods were banned from being imported to the country. So in the long run, yes, it did help the country because through that, we were able to halt the outflow of the foreign reserves in the country. But then again, moving inside the country, the issue of major issue of inflation, major issue of people's income decreasing. Like we said, cancer treating was imported because I remember cancer is being cancer treatment is imported from India actually. It's imported from India. I do not know the company which gives it, but it's imported from India, and Demo is the people who import it to Sri Lanka. So because right. Okay, right. So so now moving into the what I was speaking on. Yeah, on the issue on the people's income. So again, because of the pandemic, the people's income decreased in a very, very large scale. So people were finding it very hard to find their ends meet. And also from the other side of it, inflation kept on rising because the government, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, started printing money. Again, like the US, they did start printing money because normally what happens is when the government sees that the country's the currency float is decreasing, central banks of each country does print money. So I mean, it's a normal occurrence. But then in the pandemic situation in present 2020, it increased like because of the stimulus checks, like the 5,000 rupee allowance which was given to many families, and also the other kind of to the healthcare sector, there was a 2,500 allowance per day which was given. If I'm correct, I'm not 100% sure on that. 2,500 allowance was given per day, and then the 5,000 benefit which was given for unemployed families. And then also due to the government needing to spend a huge lot on healthcare systems, a lot of the money, the printing of money increased in a very, very rapid scale inside the country. Mind you, money printing is a big issue which came in with the regime, with the present regime. I mean, when they were in power in the past also, one big issue they had was money printing, because Maithripala Sirisena's government did not have money printing into this extent, right? I mean, obviously they print money, but they did not print money into this extent rather than the current regime, or even when the current regime was in power in the past situations, right? So, like I said, Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, or I mean even Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government, same people around the country. So these people's one main objective is like printing money and increasing the circulation in the country, right? So that's like one of the biggest things they do. They have their personal things, and also they have the government. Like I said, the rapid scale development to increase that. They do have this money printing mechanisms going in, and they give a very, very huge exposure into, like they throw in a lot of money, floating currency into the circulation of the society. So that's one thing which happened. So with the pandemic coming into play, the money printing also increased, whereas basic economics is that when money printing increases, inflation increases, and also with inflation increasing, interest rates keep dropping down, right? So because as the pandemic hit, inflation rates which were in 5%, interest rates which were in 5% dropped down to 3%, dropped down to 2.5%, and then it was increased to 3%. And recently, last week, it was again increased from 0.5%. Yeah, 0.5% increase in interest rates risen. So basically, right now, if I give a small story, interest rates in the country for savings accounts remains at 3.5% to 3%, depending on the bank. And normal fixed deposits, FD rates remain at around 1 year. FD rate would remain around 6% or 5.5%. And a 1 year treasury yield will be lasting around 8%. Right. So that is the economic part of it. Like, I mean, the basic stage on the interest rates. And apart from that, inflation, which is a big issue here in Sri Lanka, like you have US having a 7% inflation and having big issues there. And then you have, I will touch on the stock market. I'm covering into stock market after the inflation. So now you have basic example. Everyone knows international news is that US has an inflation of 7%, right? 7%, or I think in the latest Fed meeting, it was 8%, if I'm not correct. So there you can see the big impact of 7% and 8% happening in US. Whereas in Sri Lanka, econ doesn't suck. Econ is your life. Okay. So in Sri Lanka, it's actually right now with the last central bank report releasing, it's 14% here in Sri Lanka, right? 14% interest rate. So you can imagine if 7% is causing havoc in US, how 14% is causing havoc in Sri Lanka, right? Basically, if I give you a basic idea, you cannot. I think if I'm not correct, I'm not 100% correct on this, accurate on this, but a normal average income of a family per day in Sri Lanka is, I think, around 1,500 to 1,000. If I'm correct, I'm not very sure on this. Okay, so it's around 1,000 to 1,500. But then for 1,000 rupees, you cannot even buy yourself 3 meals in our country, right? That's the rate that Sri Lanka is in, right? I mean, the time bomb hasn't exploded yet. The economical time bomb has not exploded yet in our country, but it is ticking. It is ticking, right? And from being very invested in economics, it's a very big issue in our country. So moving on from that side, the inflation side of view, we need to move into what the markets a bit, right? So the stock markets, right? So basic economy is that the stock market reveals the country's economical situation, right? That's the basic idea of a stock market. But in our country, though inflation rates are increasing, though interest rates are going down, the stock market is in a continuous bull run from 2019 end. 2019 last quarter to today, up until today, the stock market is in a continuous bull run. A bull run is the stock market keeps on increasing rather than decreasing, right? So normal gain, the last year's whole gain of the market was 80%. From January 1st to December 1st, the market gained totally, the ASPI index gained 80% here, right? So you can understand how much of a contrast is there between the markets and the current economical situation inside the country. So there's a very vast difference. And why the vast difference is that because one reason is that inflation is so high that the rich people or the sharks in the economy needs to have income, and they have the income from the markets, and that's like uncontrollable. Like it's not controlled in any aspect. Like, you know, the stock market is not controlled. Like, you can economics and everyone can do so I'll be done. We can do anything in the markets, and markets can roll out. There is no regulation saying that the market needs to go only 10%, or market needs to go 20%, not like that. So the markets go up. And so what I see from this, and what you guys can gather, is that though the Sri Lankan politicians and everyone have an agenda in the country, right? Though the present government has an agenda, the major economists in the country and the major sharks or the billionaires or the top-notch economists in the country, they have a different agenda, right? That's the major thing you can take from our country. So why they have a different agenda and why their agendas differ is that because one thing is Sri Lankan governments, whatever the government comes into play, does not very much regardedly consult the major economists in our country or the major billionaires or millionaires in our country. Whatever the regime comes into play, I'm speaking about Maithripala, I'm speaking about Mahinda, I'm speaking about Gotabaya, I'm speaking about Chandrika Bandaranaike, Jaya Jayawardena, anyone. None of them take a very big impact from the major economists in our country. Why? Because one thing is they have their own agenda. Like I said, Maithripala government had the people-pleasing idea. Then this government had the rapid development. The governments before had the rapid development. Chandrika Bandaranaike, Jaya Jayawardena, they had the open economic ideas and etc. And also they do not take much more much more like they don't take knowledge, or they do not consult much from the economic perspective. So the major thing here is that the people of the country and the governments, they go into different agendas in the economical situation. And what I gather is that whatever JVP or UNP or whatever the system comes into play, or even as the motion, whoever comes into play, they need to get this vast difference into one, and they need to run in a straight line rather than going in two different lines, whatever the party comes here, right? Like I said, I'm not any political student here. I'm just an economist here because I myself is hugely invested in markets. So that's why markets and assets and etc. So that's why I'm speaking on the economic perspective. So whatever the party comes, at the end of the day, whatever party comes, like wrapping up, whatever the party comes into play here, what you guys need to do is that they'll need to learn not to differ from a economist, like the working party or the normal people in our country, the economics. They do not need to differ from these two routes and have the same agenda when walking into the economical perspective of the country, regardless of whatever party or whatever situation it is. That's all.
Thank you very much, Dinuka. That was very comprehensive, and I think it beautifully summed
I'll
up
tell
the
you one
economic
thing.
policies.
I'll tell you one thing. The foreigners are wondering how the hell we are still alive in this country after listening to all that. That's for sure.
I believe that's
Exactly.
the,
That's what I said. That's what I'm saying, sir. It's a time bomb here, sir. It's a time bomb. It's a time bomb.
exactly. I'm sure I myself
I
certainly
think
do
it's
echo
not
those thoughts.
only the foreigners who are wondering that.
Yeah,
Akila,
No,
would you
us
like
as
to
well.
continue on that?
Honestly.
From that point, Akila, could you continue? I
No.
hate
No.
to. Okay, all right.
Okay,
and yes,
Sanilka?
I just told you that I only know 25 chapters in the econ book.
you don't necessarily need to follow your econ book. Now, what Dinuka did was he drew references from his standing knowledge of economics to the what has been
So
happening.
what if my standing knowledge is the econ book?
Sanilka, it's not like Nohim and I have extensive. We've only learned 5 chapters.
Y'all don't have a say in it.
Sayaka, I never studied economics in school. Huh? I never studied economics in school. I was a
Stop
math
it.
student.
Sanilka, just tell what's your view on Sri Lanka situation at the moment. I think that will be good enough for
Yes,
Okay, fine.
exactly. We just need your
It's going
sense
to-
of direction. We want to see what exactly, as a
Okay.
youth yourself, what do you feel that the government should be focusing on? I would very much like to
Okay.
hear whether you feel
Yeah.
that the government, in terms of
Yep.
ecological policy, environmental policies, have been consistent with your hopes and aspirations. If you can.
Yeah. Oh my God. Okay. So I am not like a political science student again to like have this barapatala vachana. Okay, sorry, those heavy words and all that. So okay, according to me, I feel like the country is in an economic crisis right now. Our GDP is extremely low right now. Like when we were in when we had war and all that, Mahinda Rajapaksha's time, we had an increase in the GDP. That means there were much more foreign investors in the country. So like everyone was after the war ended in our country, a lot of foreign investors were interested in the country. So therefore, like our GDP went up those days. But then during Maithripala Sirisena's time and all, like it just went lower and lower, and now it's just at a very detrimental point. It's like a minus. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know much into detail and all that, but I would think, okay, the current government did think of this solution as of like creating products within the country without importing it. Like they try to stop imports. And yeah, so they tried to like create pohora, that means fertilizer and all sorts, but then it failed. Failed because one thing is that they did not give much of a time. They did not give like time for these these producers to like end up producing these in like a time period and all that. And also, it's not that it was a wrong decision, but it was just the wrong time to take that decision. So I understand the motives of the government, and yeah, organic fertilizer policy flop. That's what you would call it. Yes. So, I mean, if they had given a time period, if they had tested it out, if they had like a ministry or like a panel allocated for this so that they would understand the concerns of these farmers, maybe like understand that you can't just switch to organic fertilizers and all sorts, this problem wouldn't have happened. And also like the economic crisis, I'm not really sure what kind of solution Sri Lanka should take. So one of the solutions economically like is like to increase production, but to increase production the country should have like money to again add to it, right? You need money to subsidize these factories and all sorts. So the country is lacking in that aspect as well. So the only option, like the other options are like to take loans and all, and also IMF. I believe that that's how you pronounce it, but yeah. So, but then the problem with IMF is that there are certain policies in IMF that don't fit our ideologies, like privatizing public sectors and all sorts, which would lead to the country going into a bankrupt
If
situation.
I
But
may make a point on that, I think.
no, you continue on your point. Thank you. No, I don't know. I buy.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Please go ahead.
Please, you may voice your
No, no,
opinion.
just a small thing adding into Seneka's point. Now, Seneka spoke about the issue on the organic fertilizer and all. Like I said, this present government is into very rapid changes. I mean, I said throughout my speech, they're into very rapid,
Exactly.
right? Rapid
Rapid
changes. So
changes.
that is why this organic fertilizer example came into play, where they don't give time, right? So basically, if you're telling, even when Nohim's Indian oil company issue came, they don't run like any particular time period
They don't
consideration. No,
consult. They don't
they don't
consult.
consult. Exactly. They
It's
don't
a more for
consult. They move
autocratic.
into, exactly. They move into rapid conclusions again, which in does benefit the country. I'm not saying it doesn't. For example, I showed how the import ban benefited the country. But then Seneka's example, how the fertilizer issue just kind of killed the whole country's economic, like the food generation inside the country. So it basically killed. Crops were halted. Export crops were halted. For example, tea, rubber, palm oil. Export crops were halted. For example, you can take the quarter reports of plantation companies, and you can see how their profits just rapidly went down from 50%, 30%, like big rapid. So that's the thing. This the current regime is in a very rapid change situation rather than just taking time and consulting and all.
Yeah, I think one reason for that, in my opinion, is that the president of the country was a military leader. So he kind of has he has this autocratic nature, because military leadership needs to have an autocratic leadership. Like you can't have a military under like a democratic leadership or all sorts. Like rapid decisions should be made in a military basis. So I think that's one of the reasons why this is happening. But yeah.
Yes, I think that's certainly an important point to note, and I thank you both for that very insightful discussion there. And I think a point on what Seneca concluded with last, the point on autocratic decision making. You have to consider the changes made by the 19th Amendment, and of course the changes made by the 20th Amendment, because the 20th Amendment did away with a very important part of our country's constitutional makeup, of a commitment to democracy, you could say. It previously, by way of the 19th Amendment, you had a more refined, stronger constitutional council. But of course, now it is no longer there. It has been dissolved, and in its stead, there has been created, a parliamentary committee has been created, and as such, now it's overseen by the parliamentary committee. Now, the problem with the parliamentary committee there, in my opinion, and many experts have attested to this, notable individuals being Dr. Asaka Velikala, who has made his reflections very clear on the matter, who has repeatedly stated that the CCC, the Constitutional Council, is an important part in protecting our constitutional integrity, and of course to ensure that those who have the reins of power are held to account themselves. Because in the Constitutional Council you had the opposition leader and including many other people, many other representatives from both sides of the aisle, and more importantly you had outsiders as well. And in the parliamentary committee it's exclusive to the parliament, and representation may be disproportionate. Sure, sir, gladly. And I think the most important thing we need to know from everything that we discussed is that you have these great overarching concerns that are prevalent today, and the failures of past governments, past regimes in their various policies have brought us to the status quo. And any government wishing to secure governmental power in the future will have to address these issues. The people have, in fact, had a change of attitudes. They're no longer wishing for a political party to essentially address their more linear concerns, but they want they're in fact hoping that they will get a party which can remedy these long-standing issues. Now we are feeling the burden of inflation. They're feeling the austerity measures that the government has put in place, and I believe Dhyani made a point to say that even inhalers were banned at a time when this import ban was set place. I believe that has since been revoked, but the understanding is that these austerity measures have just been the start, and the party which is going to come into power will not only have to address these matters, they'll have to come up with new revenue streams, like Dinuka said, to remedy the revenue losses that have been incurred in the past. And the disconnect between the stock market, the stock market economy and the real economy can be seen in the disparities of living conditions, and all those were brilliantly encapsulated by Dinuka. And I think those are points of reflections that we need to harp on. And more importantly, the political changes to the country right now are needed. There are important political changes that we all spoke about here today that are vital. And I think if you're in this debate, I believe we are hoping to see this, and I'm sure sir would share his reflections soon, and I will give him the time for that. We are hoping to see a debate on these points. We feel as Sri Lankans these points are important, why they encompass the aspirations of our peoples and us, the Sri Lankan youth. And as such, I'd like to end with that, and I would like to thank all my panelists for the brilliant discussion that they were part of here today. And it was certainly memorable, and I look forward to doing another panel discussion, maybe at a later time. Yes, I would like to yield the floor to Viman sir to say a few words and conclude the session. Thank you everyone for being a part of this panel discussion, and thank you all for listening.